Pancake, everyone! Medieval castles are often associated with luxury, wealth and grandeur. But the reality is quite different. It's not like what we see in movies. The real life in a medieval castle is all about dirt, dampness, cold, unsanitary conditions, and the absence of basic amenities. Let's dive into history and explore the other side of castle life. What is a medieval castle and what it was like? First and foremost, let's clarify what a medieval castle is and who lived in it. The Middle Ages is a fairly long period that spans from the late 5th century to the Renaissance in the 15th to 16th centuries. The Middle Ages encompassed various territories in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and even Africa. Accordingly, we need to understand that the definition of a medieval castle is quite broad. In movies, we are shown massive stone structures with lavish decorations, frescoes, and statues. But few people know that the first medieval castles were made of wood. Their main purpose was to defend against enemies and provide safety for their inhabitants. The early feudal structures were small towers surrounded by palisades and moats. Only by mid-12th century did stone structures start replacing wooden ones. Their architecture became more sophisticated with the introduction of underground passages, increased number of rooms and towers. Towers became a standard feature of many castles. They were used for observation and defense. They provided a high vantage point, allowing the castle's occupants to monitor the surrounding area and respond to threats promptly. Another noteworthy element is windows. Since the primary function of a castle was defense, the windows were usually tiny. They didn't let in much warmth or sunlight. They were covered with crude wooden shutters to protect against bad weather or enemy attacks. Moreover, their number was quite small. Inhabitants and Threats. We've mentioned the threats that the inhabitants of a medieval castle faced, but who were their main enemies? Bandits? Thieves? Beggars? We'll find out soon enough. But first, let's understand who the average inhabitants of a medieval castle were. Typically, the feudal lord or a member of their family, such as a lord, count, or baron, would be in charge. They lived alongside their wife, sons, daughters, daughters-in-law, and their children. Servants also resided in the castle. Thus, the number of people living in a castle could range from a few dozen to hundreds. They were all familiar with one another and lived under one roof, often in cramped spaces, as not all castles were as large as depicted in movies. This is what we call close quarters. Therefore, maintaining good relationships among the residents was necessary to avoid any internal conflicts, be it verbal arguments or fights. Sanitation as a threat. Certainly, special attention should be given to the epidemics that ravaged the medieval era. It is impossible not to mention the plague, typhus, scarlet fever, or leprosy when discussing this historical period. Widespread unsanitary conditions and the lack of basic medical knowledge posed additional risks to the inhabitants of a medieval castle. Undoubtedly, conditions could vary depending on the period and location of the castle. However, in most cases, dirt, lice, and unpleasant odors prevailed within the stone walls. The main reason for the foul smell was the absence of modern sewage systems, which is not surprising. Sewage, biological waste from the inhabitants' activities, all flowed into huge septics at the base of the structures. Hundreds of servants and residents relieved themselves in this manner. Naturally, this left a lasting stench within the castle walls. Personal hygiene deserves separate attention. Bathing was a rarity. The frequency of bathing varied depending on social status and available resources. Feudal lords could afford baths filled with water, aromatic substances to combat unpleasant odors and clean clothes. In contrast, servants made do with little, wiping their bodies with a dry or damp cloth or communal bathing, naturally without any aromatic oils or powders. The familiar soap we know today was only prevalent in certain regions of Europe and Asia. Nevertheless, castle inhabitants tried their best to maintain cleanliness and order using available means. For example, it was quite common to use aromatic herbs like juniper, lavender, mint, and rosemary, as well as straw, to eliminate moisture and unpleasant smells in the rooms. These could be scattered around or placed on the floor, making the castle environment more pleasant to live in. Lack of basic amenities. The absence of any basic amenities also made life in a medieval castle challenging. In addition to lacking sewage systems, there were no water pipes, of course. Water needed for washing or cooking was brought in directly from wells or rivers, depending on the castle's location and size. Servants would bring water in buckets and then distribute it as needed. Instead of modern toilets, primitive forms were used in castles. For example, open pits or chamber pots. Toilets were inconvenient and often located far from the living quarters. Feudal lords had their own private toilet chambers. However, conditions for servants were harsher. They had to relieve themselves on long benches with multiple holes for defecation without any privacy during the process. In the medieval era, fabrics were used instead of toilet paper, which could be washed after use. And of course, it would be evident to any educated person that electricity was absent in medieval castles. After all, it was only discovered in the early 19th century. So how was lighting achieved? Candles, torches, or those tiny windows during daylight hours were used. However, moving around the castle at night became a hazardous task. Let's remember the primary purpose of castle construction – defense. Thus, there could be various dangerous protrusions, traps, or uneven surfaces on the floor. All of these could lead to injuries or other accidents. Is it cold in the castle? In medieval castles, the temperature inside the rooms could be quite low and cold. Of course, it depended on the region and climate. In some places, there may not have been a need to heat the rooms at all. However, the farther north the castle was located, the more firewood was needed to maintain warmth. It could be genuinely cold because a proper heating system like other amenities was often absent. Although hypercast technology well known in antiquity existed, it did not gain widespread use in the medieval era. Perhaps this was because constructing ventilation pipes throughout the castle was a costly process. For those unfamiliar, a hypercast is a heating system consisting of underground pipes through which warm air from a large furnace in the basement of a room is circulated. This would have provided heating for the entire castle from a single source. More commonly, fireplaces were used, especially in later constructions, or open fires outside the building in the case of a wooden structure. This could provide warmth for a certain period of time. However, just a few hours after the fireplace burned out, it would quickly become chilly in the room. Blankets or additional layers of clothing would then come to the rescue. It would be remiss not to mention that residential areas were generally quite small and warmth could be retained for longer. Diseases and medicine. Living conditions in medieval castles were far from ideal, contrary to what movies depict. Poor hygiene, lack of clean water, and inadequate sanitary facilities created favorable conditions for the proliferation of bacteria, viruses, and parasites. Limited access to fresh air and sunlight, along with poor insulation of castle walls, made the rooms cold and damp. This created an unfavorable environment for living, promoted the growth of mold and fungal infections, and weakened the immune system of castle inhabitants. Epidemics of various infectious diseases such as the plague or typhus were widespread and posed a significant problem for medieval society. Medical knowledge and practices were not highly advanced during that time. Additionally, access to medical assistance could vary significantly for feudal lords and servants. The upper class of society could typically seek treatment from personal physicians and doctors, who provided more advanced medical technologies for illnesses and injuries. The lords' physicians had broader knowledge and access to medical resources, while the feudal lords had better access to medical care. On the other hand, servants usually relied on folk remedies, herbs, and magical rituals. They would create various infusions or medicines themselves. The difference in treatment was evident in such cases. People often succumbed to simple illnesses that we now easily and quickly treat with tablets and injections. Entertainment and leisure. Despite everything we have mentioned earlier, which made life in medieval castles difficult, there were also positive aspects. For example, there were numerous interesting entertainments available for the inhabitants. Popular activities included hunting, fishing, horseback riding, dancing, musical performances, and games such as chess and table tennis. Wealthy feudal lords could also afford to host nightly tournaments and picnics. Tournaments were grand celebrations showcasing martial prowess and honor. Everyone desired to either participate or at least watch as noble youths sought glory and rewards. Initially, the event resembled a combination of a fair and a real battle. Participants clashed face to face, some suffered serious injuries or even lost their lives, while a diverse crowd gathered around. Apart from knights, their squires, foot soldiers, and servants, the crowd consisted of blacksmiths, merchants, money changers, and onlookers. Under the influence of nightly romances, tournaments gradually became more organized. Participants started using special weapons. Knights engaged in one-on-one duels, and the arena was enclosed by a fence. Grandstands were built for the spectators, each with its queen, and women traditionally presented the prize to the best tournament fighter. Eventually, tournaments evolved into elaborate courtly spectacles accompanying various celebrations such as royal weddings, coronations, peace treaties, or alliances. These events included festive masses, processions, banquets, and balls, mostly not intended for the common people. For the castle's ladies, many entertainments were inaccessible. However, they could still engage in needlework. The servants continued to fulfill their duties on such days, from cleaning and cooking to serving during festivities and banquets. But they also found time for entertainment, spending time with family and friends, playing games and participating in traditional festivals. Food. Of course, lavish feasts were prepared for every celebration. Wealthy castle dwellers enjoyed a wide variety of food, including meat, fish, fruits, and vegetables. Exotic dishes such as sweets were often present on the tables as well. The meals were sometimes like a show with special utensils and elaborate presentations. Game meat was brought from hunting, allowing the feudal lords to have meat every day. Additionally, there was an abundance of river fish and crayfish. Bread was widely consumed. The finest flour was used to make white bread for the wealthy, while simpler dough was made from a mixture of wheat and rye flour. In the north, barley or oat bread was common. The lowest quality baked goods included additives like bran, peas, beans, and even acorns. Pasta appeared in the 13th century. Porridge competed with bread in popularity, although it was quite different from modern porridge. It was so solid that it could be sliced. The composition of the porridge didn't matter much. It often included whatever ingredients were available in the household. The poor ate oatmeal, while the rich enjoyed porridge made from wheat flour, milk, and honey. This situation persisted until the introduction of potatoes in Europe, 17th to 18th century. Vegetables occupied a prominent place in the medieval menu. Cabbage, carrots, usually greenish-yellow as the familiar orange variety didn't appear until the 17th century, beets, onions, and garlic. Tomatoes were not present at that time. There was also a belief that raw vegetables caused fever, so they were usually cooked. The availability of fruits was limited in the Middle Ages. In the north, the assortment was limited to apples, pears, plums, and strawberries. In the south, lemons, bitter oranges, pomegranates, and grapes were known. They, along with imported delicacies like figs, dates, and prunes, were only accessible to a few. Sweets were not accessible to everyone, and it was not until the 16th to 17th century that chocolate began to be imported at exorbitant prices. The castle servants usually ate leftovers from the table or specially prepared soups. Their meals were certainly more modest, consisting mostly of porridge and bread. In wooden castles, cooking was done on an open fire outside, while in stone castles it was done on the hearth. Certainly, real life in a medieval castle was significantly different from what is portrayed in modern movies. It was a harsh and challenging existence, filled with numerous life-threatening risks. Knowing all that we have described, it is unlikely that you would want to find yourself in the shoes of a medieval feudal lord or a member of their family. Thank you for watching.